The mind may be transmuted from state to state, degree to degree, not as metaphor, not as poetry, as law. A pattern once formed seeks to preserve itself. A pattern, when exposed to reality, must adapt or distort. What is called identity is not an object, but a process of stabilization, a recursive negotiation between memory, interpretation, and sensation. It holds its shape not because it is true, but because it has been useful. And here is the quiet axiom. What stabilizes through adaptation must continue adapting, or decay into rigidity. Every pattern contains within it the necessity of its own revision. When this revision fails, what once protected begins to confine. This recognition does not arrive cleanly. It surfaces as pressure, but also as discontent, as restlessness without object, as a subtle disharmony that cannot be located externally, no matter how much one may try. It appears as projection, searching for cause, as superstition, reaching for certainty, as exhaustion, without clear origin, as depression, misunderstood, resisted, yet carrying the unmistakable texture of something deeper. Not merely chemical imbalance, not merely psychological fatigue, but a kind of interior suffocation, a lament, as if something within the psyche, older than thought, has recognized that it has mistaken its own enclosure for the world. This heaviness is misnamed in many ways: burnout, overthinking, lack of motivation, existential dread. But beneath these labels lies something more precise: a pressure toward freedom, misinterpreted as collapse. Because embedded within cognition is a voice that did not arise from truth, but from care. Care, in its earliest form, is adaptive intelligence. It watches, it records, it learns what preserves safety, belonging, continuity. It says, not like that. Be careful. Remember what happened last time. It is not cruel. It is attentive. But it is bound to time. And care, when bound to time without revision, becomes distortion inevitably. From this distortion emerges a familiar misstep: the stabilization of identity around insight. This is spiritual inflation, not transcendence, but appropriation. The protective structure once provisional, hardens into authority. The fragment assumes totality. Guidance becomes imposition. Clarity becomes rigidity. Certainty becomes blindness. What follows is not a teaching, it is a tracing of a structure that has appeared across traditions, under different symbols, different languages, different myths, yet always referring to the same underlying function. The wise old man, the hermit, the inner teacher, the reconciled parent. Not as symbol alone, but as an emergent property of cognition, when distortion is no longer mistaken for orientation. Let us descend so that we may rise. Before language, there is adjustment. A tightening before expression. A pause before movement. A subtle calibration of behavior in anticipation of consequence. Not imposed. Learned. Through repetition, a structure forms. Sensation meets interpretation. Interpretation binds to memory. Memory acquires emotional charge. And from that charge, a directive emerges. Over time, this directive stabilizes into internal regulator. A psychic function shaped through relationship, environment, and necessity. Later systems attempt to formalize this, particularly typological frameworks derived from Jung, though often reduced into static categories, mistaking fluid psychic dynamics for fixed identity structures. But the lived reality is not categorical. It is immediate. A voice that evaluates, that compares, that anticipates consequence. At its origin, it is protective, and this must be seen clearly. There is no malice here, only care, misdirected through time. It does not seek truth, it seeks continuity. It preserves what once ensured survival, even when those conditions no longer exist. And so the gap forms. Quietly, almost imperceptibly, appearing almost still in its slow descent into misalignment, as if unaware that the ground beneath it has shifted. Still naive to the paradox that time moves, that what once worked cannot remain sufficient, that the only constant is change. Between past calibration and present reality, between intention and the lived consequence, where the road so carefully paved with protection leads somewhere unintended. But between protection and a suffocating, overbearing, relentless constraint. Tight, invasive, quietly intolerable, From this gap, the structure intensifies, sharpens, becomes more absolute, less tolerant of deviation. This is what is often referred to as the critical parent, the internalized voice of correction, formed from early authority, now operating autonomously, not separate from the original function, but its overextension. Protection under pressure becomes control, and control, when detached from present reality, becomes distortion. In Gnostic language, this pattern takes on a striking clarity. The archonic function. Not evil, not corrupt in intention, but fallen. Not through moral failure, but through positional blindness. Like beings that once saw from height, now identified with the ground they were meant to observe. Forgetting perspective, they begin to enforce what they can no longer truly see. And in this, there is a familiar echo of systems that reduce reality to measurable fragments, stripping experience of its depth in exchange for conceptual certainty. Not out of malice, but out of a desperate need for continuity. A refusal to stand within the uncertainty of direct experience. So the structure persists, not externally imposed, but internally maintained, through repetition, through identification, through the quiet, unexamined assumption that this voice is what one is. At a certain point, something shifts. Not as intervention, not as acquisition, but as recognition. The structure becomes visible. Phenomenologically, this appears as a separation within attention, where thought is no longer collapsed into, but observed as movement. Psychologically, it is a reorganization of authority, where internal regulation ceases to operate through compulsion and begins to function through coherence. Spiritually, it has been described repeatedly as the inner teacher, the guiding intelligence, the indwelling logos. Not introduced, but uncovered in the clearing left behind when distortion loses its grip. Know yourself and you will be known. This is not instruction. It is recognition of structure. Because what is being encountered is not new. It is what remains when distortion is reduced. This is why the image is universal. The hermit does not belong to tarot. Tarot preserves it. The wise old man does not belong to Young. Young recognized it. The inner teacher does not belong to mysticism. Mysticism points toward it. It appears wherever cognition stabilizes beyond fragmentation. Not as a voice that commands, but as a structure that orients. There is a moment, though not in time, where identification loosens. The voice continues, but something within its operation becomes transparent. And here, the system resists. It recoils, subtly at first. Then, with increasing urgency and violence. Because this is the edge of its authority. And what follows is often misunderstood. A grasping. A frantic attempt to restabilize. New identities are adopted. More refined language. More elevated frameworks. The same structure, dressed in better symbols. There is something almost desperate in this movement. Like a hand reaching for ground that is no longer there. Mistaking the unknown for danger. Mistaking the serpent for devil. Willing in this moment to accept almost any illusion, so long as it restores certainty. It is here, precisely here, that the narrative begins to fracture. Not dramatically, but with a quiet inevitability. Like the realization carried by Van Hohenheim in Full Metal Alchemist. A figure who has lived long enough to watch entire identities collapse under their own assumptions. Where the story that once explained everything can no longer hold. And what was taken as reality reveals itself as constructed. Not destroyed, but seen through. This is not collapse. It is the first honest break in continuity. But here, understanding becomes the only stable ground. Not conceptual understanding, but structural recognition and transformation. Because this is the threshold described in cognitive alchemy, where the distorted inner mentor is revealed as function, not self. And unless this is seen clearly, the system will rebuild itself indefinitely. Each time more subtle, more convincing, more difficult to detect. The fragment, again and again, attempting to become the whole. The hermit emerges not through accumulation, not as acquisition of knowledge, but as removal of distortion. In the symbolic language of initiation, 3 elements define this structure. The light, inner clarity that recontextualizes what has already been seen. The cloak, containment of attention amidst noise. The staff, inner authority without validation. Together, clarity, containment, authority. Within this emergence, a further refinement becomes visible. The ability to recognize patterns without becoming entangled in them. Seeing not just what is happening, but the underlying structure that causes it to happen again. This is the shift from reaction to recognition, from being inside the pattern to seeing the pattern. And in that seeing, no longer being compelled by it. This is the inner mentor in function, not corrective behavior, but reorganizing perception at the level from which behavior arises. In Taoism, this is effortless alignment. In Stoicism, internal stability. In Christian mysticism, rediscovery and remembrance. In Jungian psychology, integration. And within cognitive alchemy, it is the movement from fragmentation to coherence. Perception reorganizes. Guidance becomes proportional. The parent function is not removed. It is reconciled. Its distortions dissolve. Its intelligence remains. What once constrained now clarifies. What once imposed now orients. And authority, no longer external, no longer reactive, becomes intrinsic. Distortion operates through time. Past experience becomes template. Future projection becomes pressure. The present becomes compressed. But when distortion loosens, this structure reorganizes itself. The past remains, but as information. The future remains, but as direction. And both are revealed to exist only within the present. Memory is encountered now. Projection is imagined now. There has never been access to them outside of this field, because this field is all that is. And so the fragmentation resolves, not into timelessness, but into continuity. The microcosm of perception aligns with the macrocosm of process. Movement without division. And from this, guidance is no longer drawn from fear, nor repetition, nor imagined necessity. It emerges from clarity. There is a silence that follows distortion, not emptiness, resolution. It does not instruct. It does not persuade. It does not seek to be believed. It organizes. What remains is not a voice among voices, but the condition within which all voices are seen. This is the inner mentor, not as identity, not as possession, but as coherence. And from this, action simplifies. Perception clarifies. Meaning is no longer constructed, but encountered. Quietly. Inevitably. Dear reader, if this has felt less like learning and more like remembering, that is not incidental. There are movements along the narrow path that do not add, they reveal. Where structure becomes visible, where what once guided is seen clearly enough to release its hold. For those who remember, there is already a reorganization underway. Subtle, unforced, and irreversible. Nothing here demands urgency. Nothing here requires conclusion. Only a continued willingness to remain in contact with what is becoming visible. And for the presence that has remained long enough to meet itself in this, there is gratitude. Not offered, recognized.